everyone, and welcome to this event that's jointly arranged by the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the University of Tasmania's College of Arts, Law and Education. In welcoming people tonight, I want to express on behalf of both the University of Tasmania and AIIA acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting here in Hobart, but also the lands on which we are recording, or people are hearing us from afar. We pay deep respect to the Palawa people of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and acknowledge their elders past and present. This land always was and always will be. As I said, this event is jointly presented by AIIA and the University of Tasmania in its politics and international relations program. It's part of our joint program that we've been running this year, and this is our fourth event in this series. In handing over to our topic tonight, which is an extraordinarily important one, which seems to have dropped off a bit of the political radar thanks to Ukraine. We're talking about Myanmar. Can foreign companies make a difference? And we're enormously lucky to have two specialists, both named Nicholas, who are specialists on Myanmar in terms of both practical politics and research and academic foresight. So I'd like to introduce the first Nicholas to introduce the second Nicholas. So introducing Professor Nicholas Farrelly, who is a head of social sciences at the University of Tasmania. He studied at the Australian National University and at the University of Oxford. And for the past 20 years, he's researched political conflict and social change in Myanmar and neighbouring countries. In 2006, he founded New Mandela, a website which has become a prominent public forum in Southeast Asian studies. And from 2015 to 18, he was the inaugural director of the ANU Myanmar Research Centre. In 2020, he was appointed to the board of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Australia Asian Council. He's also a very good friend and colleague of AIIA, and so welcome, Nicholas.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Kim, for that generous introduction. And I'd just like to reiterate the university's strong support and indeed delight in the partnership that has been established with the AIIA here in Tasmania. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today and pay respects to elders past and present, and in particular to any Indigenous people who are joining us in the room or online for this session. Tonight, as Kim said, we're going to be discussing Myanmar. And Myanmar, since the February 2021 coup, has taken a profound turn for the worse. We've seen thousands of people killed, over 10,000 currently locked up, hundreds of thousands newly displaced, and quite literally tens of millions of lives upended by the military's muscled up intervention. This, of course, comes after a period of around a decade when, while conditions in Myanmar were far from perfect, and I know this evening our speaker will be reflecting on some of those imperfections, there was at least a sense that things could get better. And yet, with the coup, a hammer blow against Myanmar's democrats and many civil society and commercial actors, things, of course, have deteriorated starkly. I think it's also important on an occasion like this that we also note the imprisonment of our friend and colleague, Professor Sean Turnell from Macquarie University, who worked for so many years to reform Myanmar's economy, serving selflessly and generously to ensure that Myanmar's people could enjoy a better quality of life. Of course, he's been locked up since soon after the military retook power, and we certainly hope that Sean is released at the very earliest opportunity. Tonight, with all of this calamitous context in mind, we have the great pleasure of welcoming to our university and to our joint AAAA lecture series somebody who has devoted an enormous amount of his recent time, effort and energy to understanding Myanmar and to appreciating some of its challenges and opportunities. And this evening, Nicholas Coppel, Australia's former ambassador to Myanmar, he served in Yangon, and I think fair to say, Nicholas also in Naypyidaw for a period from 2015 to 2018. And I think our audience appreciates just how important those years were to the trajectory that Myanmar had been on. And of course, Nicholas brought to bear his skills as a senior career diplomat to bear on Australia's relationship with Myanmar during that period. Earlier in his career, Nicholas, as well as his many senior roles in the Canberra bureaucracy, served as Australia's special coordinator of the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, which I think we also appreciate was an enormous national and international effort. Nicholas was also previously Deputy High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea, Deputy Ambassador to the Philippines, and indeed earlier in his career, he served in the Australian Embassy in Washington as First Secretary. And so it was with that background that I first met Nicholas when he was getting ready for his posting to Myanmar, and we had many interactions during that period. I must say, I've always found your insights, your rigour and your practical judgment of Myanmar affairs to be exemplary. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation this evening about the role of foreign companies in particular. What can they do in the wake of the coup? How can they best manage their interactions with Myanmar society right now? And what role might they indeed play in the country's future? I think this is the kind of specific nuts and bolts attention to the Myanmar situation that we can all benefit from. And we're very pleased, Nicholas, that you can join us tonight. So I'll come back a bit later on to help moderate the Q&A. But for now, over to Nicholas. Very warm welcome, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you also to the Australian Institute for International Affairs and the University of Tasmania for inviting me today to give this talk. My talk today looks at how foreign companies have responded to the coup, and I've divided this into two parts. The first part looks at sanctions and assesses their impact on foreign company behaviour in Myanmar. The second part looks at the role of foreign companies that haven't been subject to sanctions and discusses their responses to the coup. But first, I should perhaps set the scene and let me begin very briefly by giving an account of the coup which took place in Myanmar only 20 months ago. In November 2020, elections were held in Myanmar and Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won 83%, a resounding 83% of the contested seats. The military-backed party, on the other hand, won 7% of the contested seats. And so with that disappointing result, the Commander-in-Chief of Myanmar's Defence Forces decided on the day that all the elected representatives were to come together to elect the new president, the Commander-in-Chief mounted a coup, and he detained the President Win Myint, detained Aung San Suu Kyi, and many other members of the National League for Democracy government. A state of emergency was declared, and all legislative powers, all judicial power, and all executive power was transferred to the Commander-in-Chief. Many countries and the United Nations started by issuing statements expressing various degrees of outrage at what had happened. Meanwhile, back in Myanmar, the people took to the streets in their thousands, hundreds of thousands. The military tolerated the protests, thinking that they would fizzle out with the passage of time. But they were wrong. Instead of fizzling out or dying down, they just grew larger. And so the military started to shoot them. On one day alone, 154 unarmed protesters were shot and killed. The death toll today stands at over 2,200. In an earlier era, many countries, but especially Western countries, would have imposed sanctions in response to these developments. But there have been no calls for economy-wide sanctions in response to the developments that have taken place in Myanmar. The reason for this is that broad economy-wide sanctions these days are, in the words of a former UN Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, a very blunt instrument. Many studies have shown that they fail to achieve their policy objectives. They have negative humanitarian consequences and worsen both human rights and democratic freedoms. The sanctions applied to Myanmar following the crushing of the democracy movement in 1988 are widely assessed as having done more harm than good. These days, policymakers and academics alike favour so-called smart or targeted sanctions. And it wasn't long after last year's coup in Myanmar before European and North American countries started to impose these so-called targeted sanctions. They targeted named military personnel and their family members, targeted military-owned or controlled businesses, and in some countries they also applied them to state-owned enterprises. The rest of the world, including Australia, New Zealand, and all Myanmar's major trading partners, have not imposed any new sanctions on Myanmar. Three of those major trading partners, that's China, Thailand, and Japan, account for 58% of Myanmar's exports and 50% of Myanmar's imports. So the purpose of these targeted sanctions is not to impoverish the nation. They aim to put pressure on those military personnel to encourage them to change their outlook and indeed possibly even to reverse what they've done, certainly to step back. But will these targeted sanctions achieve their aim? Unless Myanmar's major trading partners in those three countries join in, these targeted sanctions are unlikely to have much bite to them. But that's not the only reason for their limited efficacy. A UN Human Rights Commission report, which came out just a couple of years before the coup, found that there were actually only 11 foreign companies in 14 different joint ventures with military-owned or controlled businesses, and only 44 foreign companies with other types of relationship with military-owned businesses. That's not a lot of companies. I mean, there are more than 1,800 foreign companies with investments in Myanmar. So only 14 of those are with military-controlled businesses. And of those 11 companies in joint ventures with the military, none of them are domiciled in any of the countries imposing sanctions. They mostly come from Korea or Japan. Only two of the companies listed in joint ventures have announced their intention to end their joint venture. Kirin, which is the Japanese beer and spirits company, was in two beer joint ventures with the military conglomerate Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited. Very shortly after the coup, they decided to terminate the joint ventures. First, they sought to persuade the military conglomerate to sell its share in the joint venture to Kirin. The conglomerate wasn't interested in divesting, and Kirin decided then to look to see if it could sell it to somebody else outside the country. There were no takers, and in the end, Kirin has decided to sell its joint venture to the military partner. The activist group Justice for Myanmar condemned the sale, describing it as a windfall gain for the military conglomerate, which would ensure a continued stream of revenue to finance atrocity crimes. So having urged foreign companies to cut their ties with the military-owned or controlled businesses, they now urged Kirin to reverse its decision, or, they said, be held accountable for their complicity in the military's international crimes. The other joint venture was POSCO Coated and Colour Steel, which is a Korean steel roofing manufacturer, and make a product very similar to what we call Colour Bond here. So it announced early on that they would change how they operate. First, they suspended their dividend payments to the joint venture partner, and then they said they would rearrange the joint venture but continue to make steel roofing. I haven't seen any further announcements since then, so I think they're still in their joint venture with Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited. But if we look at the other 44 companies that are in some other business relationship with the conglomerates, again, we find that all but 3 of these are domiciled in Asia and none domiciled in the jurisdictions that are imposing the sanctions. One of them, however, was Adani Ports and Special Economic Zone Limited, which is a subsidiary of the Adani Group, which you might be more familiar with. And it leased land from the second military conglomerate, the Myanmar Economic Corporation. And under the previous government, the government of Aung San Suu Kyi, it granted Adani permission to develop, operate and maintain a port on this land. But then after the coup, the Australian Centre for International Justice and Justice for Myanmar criticised Adani because it was leasing land from this conglomerate and said it was at risk of complicity with the military's crimes. Eventually, Adani decided to work on a plan to exit their investment. This was welcomed by the activist groups, but then they said Adani had to exit responsibly to mitigate the impact on their Myanmar workers and to recover what they could from the $90 million that they'd paid to the military. And again, and if they did not do that, they would be deemed of helping a terrorist military regime. So Kirin and Adani, 2 companies under pressure because of their business relationships with military conglomerates. They responded to that pressure, but we now realize that in doing so, this could benefit the military. However, the main conclusion I think that we draw from targeted sanctions is that with very few companies domiciled in the jurisdictions that are imposing the sanctions, they haven't had much impact on the military's economic interests, let alone on its mindset. Decades of isolationism, economic mismanagement, and the stigma attached to doing business with the military in Myanmar meant that actually there were very few companies, very few linkages that actually were formed during those preceding decades. And that means there was very limited scope for leverage. This casts doubt on the utility of a response to the coup, which, while appealing as virtuous, has no discernible effect on the military's funding or attitude. At the time of this UN report, state-owned enterprises came under the government rather than coming under the military, so they weren't included in the report. But since the coup, they're now under the military control, and they're seen as a source of funding available to the military, particularly the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, often referred to as MOGI. Although it has become the main focus of activist attention, so far only the EU has sanctioned with Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. It was in 4 joint ventures for gas production. 2 of these are continuing business as usual, and 2 others are also continuing, but they're now under new ownership. The 2 that are under new ownership, Petronas has one of those, or is the operator for one of those. It initially declared force majeure, but due to resource depletion rather than anything else. And then together with its foreign partners, it has decided to divest their holdings to a private oil and gas company based in Thailand. The one which has got the most attention is the Dana field, which Total, the French company, is the operator for. It initially suspended cash distributions to shareholders, so that stopped money going to the military. And this year, Total and Chevron withdrew from the production joint venture altogether, gifting their shares to the other partners in the project, including Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise. So targeted sanctions have had an impact on one company in the joint venture, Kirin, and possibly one other, POSCO, and on one company leasing land from a military conglomerate, Adani Ports, and on 2 of the offshore gas joint ventures. In all cases, the military conglomerates have benefited, and in some cases have increased their ownership and share of any profits coming from the investments. This outcome suggests that targeted sanctions have not achieved their objective of crippling the military, or causing them financial pain so as to encourage them to reverse course. There are several reasons for this. First, so few countries have actually applied sanctions. Secondly, there are actually very few companies with any commercial relationship with the Myanmar military. Thirdly, the withdrawal of foreign companies under pressure of sanctions may have benefited the military. And fourthly, Myanmar's military is habituated to isolation and ignoring international pressure. One might then ask, well, if they don't work, why do we bother with them? I think that even if we know they won't work in the sense of encouraging change or even dialogue about negotiated outcome, sanctions can serve some purpose, targeted sanctions. To me, they are foremost an expression of our values, a statement of our displeasure at the coup and a signal of our solidarity with the people of Myanmar. In this sense, I see sanctions as being more about us and how we want to be perceived than about doing something to overturn the coup. For this admittedly rather limited reason, I have supported calls for the Australian government to sanction senior military personnel and military-owned or controlled businesses, although an announcement right now might not be helpful to other things which are underway. I would like now to talk about the role of foreign companies whose activities are not captured by sanctions and discuss their response to the coup. Many foreign companies have pulled out of or cancelled orders from Myanmar, even though they themselves are not accused of any military association. Many others have chosen to stay or to continue sourcing from Myanmar. It isn't always a straightforward decision for companies, and they look for guidance on how to behave responsibly. The OECD and UN have both developed non-binding guidelines and principles for responsible business. And the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business has issued guidelines on what foreign companies should do in post-coup Myanmar. Essentially, their advice is avoid and end commercial relationships with the military, obey laws and pay taxes, and if your business is causing or controlling or causing harm, consider leaving, and if you do intend to leave, do so responsibly. Advocacy groups such as Burma Campaign UK and Justice for Myanmar have taken a more aggressive approach to the issue and engage in naming and shaming companies that they say or perceive as supporting the military. Burma Campaign UK have published the names of around 100 companies on what it calls its dirty list. They argue, for example, that a company which had a pre-existing land lease from a military conglomerate, like what we saw with Adani, is somehow funding the military and is therefore complicit in the military's human rights abuses. Somewhat tenuously, an activist group argued that Australia's sovereign wealth fund, the Future Fund, was profiting from the Myanmar military's brutal oppression and campaign of terror. Its crime, apparently, was to have shares worth about $158 million in 14 different companies traded on international stock exchanges. And those companies which they had shares in had some association with Myanmar's military. But then I went one step further and said, well, the Australian government hasn't directed the Australia Fund to divest its holdings, and therefore the Australian government itself is complicit. The equity stakes, were in companies like Adani and Kirin and POSCO. New Zealand's super fund is similarly criticised. But I think the goal of these campaigns was to create a perception that all commercial connections with Myanmar have an odour about them, and to get the attention of the Australian and New Zealand governments, neither of which had joined Europe and North American governments in imposing sanctions. Selling their relatively small shareholdings in companies listed on international stock exchanges to other investors could not seriously be expected to be of any consequence to the situation in Myanmar. Just selling your shares to somebody else. Nothing else changes, except who owns those shares. Companies take into account many considerations, including the guidelines, the situation on the ground, their corporate image in deciding what to do. For example, shortly after the coup, Woodside Energy, which had large offshore petroleum exploration holdings in Myanmar, reduced its presence and demobilized its offshore exploration drilling team. The company subsequently went one step further and withdrew from Myanmar and relinquished its exploration permits. The company said its conduct was guided by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and other relevant international standards. While the company didn't have any producing assets or generate any revenue, it had, as required, a production sharing agreement with the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which would become operational if the gas fields were to be developed. So Woodside's relinquishing of the exploration permits leaves them open to being offered to as principal gas producers from China or from Russia. And the future possibility of a gas for weapons deal cannot now be ruled out. Another Australian company, Myanmar Metals, faced accusations that if it did not divest from its Bordwin mine joint venture, it would essentially be in support of the illegal, unconstitutional seizure of power. The company decided to dispose its entire interest to one of its local joint venture partners and stated the reasons for doing so were the lack of stability, clarity, and confidence in Myanmar, which made it impossible to bring international finance to bear on the project, impossible to gain access to the site, and impossible for them to meet their obligations. Civil society groups remained unhappy with this company, Myanmar Metals, and lodged a complaint with the Australian National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines, arguing that the sale could lead to millions of dollars lining the pockets of Myanmar's murderous generals. Telenor Myanmar, it's a Norwegian-owned mobile telephony provider, is another example where activists criticized the process of withdrawal from Myanmar. Telenor was criticized not because it paid taxes, not because it was paying license fees to the military junta, but for its divestment through a sales agreement with a Lebanon-based company. That company, as a condition precedent for regulatory approval, had to enter into a local partnership, so it had a local majority owner. Telenor's decision to divest was informed by the deteriorating security situation, by regulatory and compliance issues. According to the company, ensuring continuation of operations that provide affordable mobile services to support Myanmar's development and growth was also a consideration. Activist groups were concerned that the business's new owners might be less vigilant in resisting censorship and protecting customer data, and Telenor's sale would further embolden the military, putting the lives of activists, journalists, and anyone opposed to the military junta at greater risk. Telenor explained their dilemma, and I quote, they said, "A key reason for selling Telenor Myanmar is that we do not want to activate intercept equipment, which all operators are required to do. It is precisely this conflict between the requirement to comply with local law on the one hand, and the concern about human rights and the risk of violations of Norwegian and European sanctions on the other, that leaves Telenor with no choice but to sell. Selling the business is the least detrimental solution for customers, employees, and the broader society," according to Telenor. These examples from Woodside, Myanmar Metals, and Telenor all highlight the risk of unintended consequences from pressuring companies to leave. The Woodside Energy and Myanmar Metals exits could lead to more revenue for the military, and Telenor's exit is not good news for its 18 million subscribers. There are many other companies that, for various operational reasons, have decided to leave Myanmar. There's no way I can mention all of them, but they include prominent firms like Ooredoo, which is the other mobile telephony, international telephony provider in Myanmar, British American Tobacco, EDF, which is a French power group, Kempinski Hotel and Naypyidaw, Puma Energy, which is a Swiss company that supplies aviation fuel. Suzuki has shut down its 2 vehicle assembly plants, but that's largely to do with an inability to get foreign exchange, which it needs to bring in the parts. And Toyota has also postponed the opening of its Hilux assembly plant, although it's opened it just last month on a very limited basis. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but just to give you some idea of the companies that have made announcements about their departure from Myanmar. And most of them have been for business reasons. Other prominent businesses, including Western and Japanese companies, have decided to maintain their presence in Myanmar. These include the Danish brewer, Carlsberg, the world's largest container shipping line and vessel operator, Maersk, Sumitomo Corporation, Marubeni Corporation, Mitsubishi Corporation, and the French hotel group Accor. Companies that don't have a physical presence in Myanmar, but instead place orders, independently run factories, are similarly divided. Some, such as the Aldi South Group, C&A, and UK retailer Tesco, have ceased contracting Myanmar businesses, and they have cited the unpredictable nature of doing business and difficulties upholding human rights as the reasons for their decisions. But others, such as Primark, H&M, Zara owner, Inditex, Uniqlo, brands which you're probably familiar with, are continuing to have their branded products made in Myanmar. Global brands also incorporate international standards as requirements their suppliers have to meet. These include OECD and ILO labour standards such as non-discrimination, workplace diversity, equality, fair living wage, freedom of association and collective bargaining, no child or forced labour, and environmental responsibility and grievance procedures. These are becoming, all of these compliance issues are becoming increasingly difficult to monitor and enforce, and labour rights abuses have increased since the coup. But notwithstanding the efforts of global brands, I think are a force for good in Myanmar, and certainly and for Myanmar workers, and they are better off with the global brands than without them. According to UN statistics, garment exports from Myanmar to the EU, Japan, and the US, which are the main markets, were 12% higher in the first 6 months of this year than in the first 6 months of 2020, the year before the coup. So they're continuing to grow their exports, and certainly the massive depreciation of the Myanmar kyat has made Myanmar-produced products very competitive. The major conclusion, however, is that companies are deciding for themselves how to respond to the coup and the changed business outlook. Most of the companies that have announced their departure or suspension of operations were not the ones identified as in joint ventures or other commercial relationships with Myanmar military conglomerates or even with the state-owned enterprises. They were businesses without any military association, and they played an important role in lifting many Myanmar people out of poverty. They have been influenced mostly by the sharp deterioration in business conditions, especially foreign exchange difficulties. But targeted sanctions and activist pressure have the effect of stigmatizing all businesses with an exposure to Myanmar, including legitimate non-sanctioned activity. And because we're now living in an era of political consumerism, where people want to align their consumption with their political beliefs, Western companies, especially the European ones, are anxious to avoid perceptions of negative association. These companies then undertake what they call a strategic review, and their decision to exit is usually attributed to the result of that strategic review. When combined with the deterioration in the business environment, it's not a difficult decision for them to exit. It's much harder for an executive to defend a decision to stay. Stigmatization combined with COVID, economic mismanagement, incompetence of the military administration, ongoing security issues, and foreign exchange controls has certainly lowered the profitability and increased the risks, including business integrity risks of doing business in Myanmar. In my view, the departure of the companies that have left is not a cause for celebration. Their going has the same damaging effect as economy-wide sanctions would have had. New investment has also dried up from everywhere, with some limited new investment from China and Singapore. The National Unity Government in exile has contributed to this with the statement that new investments approved by the military junta will not only not be recognised, action will be taken against those investing under the military regime. A diminished foreign presence is unlikely to advance the pro-democracy movement or bring forward the demise of the junta, nor is it beneficial to the long-suffering people of Myanmar. On the contrary, it is more likely to help entrench military elites and more likely to result in the expansion of cronyism. We're already seeing signs of this. From a broad and long-term human rights perspective, staying can be a responsible option. An isolated and impoverished Myanmar, when eventually restored to democracy, would face heightened challenges of governing with a debilitated commercial sector, a small tax base, and a low-skilled workforce. The departures of Telenor and producers of gas for electricity generation will make life harder, not better, for the people of Myanmar, without adding to any financial pressure to the regime. Yes, the companies that stay will be obliged to pay taxes and in some cases rent to the government entities, which it could be said will be used to fund the military. But it could also be said that these taxes are used to fund health, education, and other essential services. Taxes go into consolidated revenue. They're not hypothecated to the military or to any particular branch of government. I believe we need to think more creatively about how foreign businesses can be leveraged to promote human rights. They may not be able to resolve conflict, but they can model good corporate behaviour by respecting human rights on issues such as worker safety, fair wages, and freedom of association, as well as by developing employee and managerial skills. We should not feel uncomfortable having a business relationship with Myanmar's private sector or buying something made in Myanmar. I mean, this isn't a controversial proposition. I saw recently on LinkedIn that the embassy of a European company, one of those one of those countries which has imposed targeted sanctions in place in Myanmar, has proudly held a business breakfast roundtable hosted by the head of the embassy. He posted on LinkedIn with a comment that it's hard to underestimate the importance of responsible companies in supporting the people of Myanmar. I agree with that. Much as we might be tempted by the concept of political consumerism and the embodied feelings of empowerment, in the case of post-coup Myanmar, isolating and abandoning the country won't help bring about change. A participant in a recent webinar said, Myanmar won't be changed by the people who have left, but by the people who have remained. And the same could be said of businesses. It is the companies that remain that can change Myanmar, not the ones that leave. We need to focus more on encouraging and supporting responsible business practices that can make a difference to the lives of Myanmar citizens. It needs to be actively supported because under the military regime, it's being suppressed. The two foreigners doing the most to improve economic management and responsible business in Myanmar have been arrested and tried in secret. They were both found guilty on trumped-up charges and are currently serving time in Myanmar's notorious prisons. Vicky Bowman, a former British ambassador to Myanmar, led the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. Sean Turnell, an Australian academic, advised Aung San Suu Kyi and her government on economic matters. I got to know them both when I was ambassador in Myanmar, and I can attest to their integrity, their competence, and their commitment to the welfare of the people of Myanmar. They were doing good and much needed work. But the military junta didn't want the spotlight on cronyism and their business practices. They wanted a compliant business community. And these two prominent, high-profile, highly respected individuals were not safe. In my concluding remarks, I'd like to say we need to focus less on judging and trolling foreign companies. This to me is lazy activism. And as I've argued this evening, it often has perverse consequences. If we care about what's happening in Myanmar, we need to think more about policies and behaviours that support the people and that seek to make Myanmar better prepared for democracy than it was in 2016. Organisations such as International IDEA are running courses through the Hertie School, it's a German graduate school for governance, for members of the National Unity Government and its institutions on policy making and analysis, as well as on media and crisis communication skills. The aim is to have a generation of skilled civil servants for when the transition to full democratic governance occurs. Programs supporting inclusive democracy and functioning constitutionalism are important, but so too are programs that support a more competitive and responsible business sector. Both are needed to ensure that the country is better prepared than it was at the time of the previous transition. What's needed is a society and people more able to resist the military, a society that can offer the prospect of a brighter future. Remember, it's the businesses, the organisations and the people who remain in Myanmar, not the ones who are outside the country, that will ultimately bring about change in Myanmar. I've offered some challenging ideas and maybe not everyone will be in agreement with me on them. So let's open the floor to some Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. And I think you're right, these are challenging ideas. You've, I think, set out for us a really creative agenda for where Myanmar can go in this next phase. And these are ideas, of course, which there are many voices, prominent voices even, find challenging. And so this evening, I'm really keen that we can draw some questions from our audience here in the room in Hobart and also from online. Anybody like to get us started? Yes, please.
Yeah, what's the Australian government doing about the two who sacrificed themselves and are in jail, basically?
I'm not familiar with
The two, you know, Sean and the other lady.
Well, Vicky Bowman's British.
Yeah.
But Sean Turnell is the Australian
Okay.
academic from Macquarie University. I mean, I'm outside of government. I've left the Australian government 4 years ago, so I'm not familiar with what the latest measures are. It's obviously, from what we know from public statements that have been made, I've been talking to many players to try and get them to put pressure on Myanmar regime, including the United Nations representatives, including ASEAN and others. But what private conversations that the embassy in Myanmar is having with the regime, I'm not familiar with. But he's been imprisoned now. He was arrested in February 2021, so it's more than a year and a half, and he's been sentenced to 3 years.
The military seem to call the country Myanmar. The Burmese people call themselves Burmese and Burma. Can you expand on that?
Well, these days, most people call it Myanmar, including people in Myanmar. I asked Aung San Suu Kyi herself, because she tends to use both terms, whether she would be changing the name of the country. This was in 2016 when she became the state councillor. And she said no, and she didn't expect or ask any one to just revert to calling it Burma. She said the reason she used both was when she was growing up, and for most of her life it's been Burma, so it's been part of, it's just what comes out of her mouth, but she also uses Myanmar. It used to be quite an issue or a point of contention, what we should be calling it. But I think these days it's, other than the United States and the UK, everyone's calling it Myanmar.
Tim, thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for that. It was very interesting. I guess I would agree that sanctions, it's difficult to draw a direct correlation between sanctions and action, but I'm not sure not taking any action helps that much. What's your view of sanctions against Russia? Given we've got
I don't think
a prominent case there.
Well, I think the situation in Russia is different from the situation in Myanmar. I mean, Russia is, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It's a nuclear-armed power, and it has invaded another country. So it's expanded its territorial claims into the territory of another country. What's happening in Myanmar is internal to Myanmar, and the world's response to Myanmar has not been the same as the world's response to what's happening in Ukraine. But the two situations aren't comparable. There are vast differences between the two.
Mm.
Got a couple of questions down the front, and I think I've also got something online maybe.
That's right.
And so just before we come to these, can I just quickly, Nicholas, ask you about your read on the telecommunications part of this story that you set out for us? Like, it strikes me that when particularly the Norwegian and the Qatari telecommunications companies came in with such muscle almost a decade ago, that was utterly transformative for Myanmar society in so many different directions. And I think most of you will know that until then, Myanmar didn't have a functioning internet in the way that we would have understood it even at that period. And then it just took off like a rocket. Those companies obviously have needed to make these difficult decisions. How do you see that playing into the future of the country and its economy more generally? Because as we all appreciate, particularly with a hybrid event like this, we are so reliant on those technologies for efficiency, productivity, connectivity, and so much more. Where does Myanmar go when those companies are no longer in the positions they were?
Well, the services are continuing to be provided, and indeed that was foremost in the minds of Telenor when they were deciding how to exit. They didn't want to just shut down the business, the 18 million subscribers that they had, and leave them without a service. So the services will be provided, but they're going to be provided by companies that are going to be more willing to comply with the edicts, including interception, supplying of data on individuals that they are interested in finding out if they're involved in People's Defence Force or in the civil disobedience movement, for example. So the people of Myanmar are not going to be as safe as they were before. Their data and their communications are going to be accessible by the military authorities. But in terms of them having a mobile phone, the access to the internet is intermittent, but that service is still being provided to them. So the clock hasn't been turned back 10 years. I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of people of Myanmar having mobile telephony. Affordable. So,
Just a big part of it. Thanks, Nicholas. We'll go to James and then we'll go to Kim. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is directly related to your presentation. You mentioned that the big boys in town, most of them have already pulled out. What about the lower end in town? Because the sort of chatter I'm hearing in Southeast Asia is that a lot of these companies, when they leave, they do a fire sale, and the Singaporeans, the Chinese, and the Malaysians are moving in. Is this true?
well, a lot of those smaller companies were Chinese, Singaporeans, and companies from Southeast Asia, companies setting up bubble tea shops and things like that. A lot of those have closed down.
No, but now the bigger boys have left town. Are they replacing the big boys?
No,
They're not.
the sales that we've seen or the exit that we've seen are either a complete shutting down or a sale to a local partner.
Thanks, James. Kim.
I was just going to ask about the tourism and travel industry in Myanmar, and that was fairly dependent on foreign companies that came in to do that, but it also employed a lot of people. I presume it's now almost defunct.
Tourism's taken a huge hit, but a lot of that's to do with COVID, and then the coup, and restrictions on foreigners coming to the country have only eased very recently. So it's tourism from overseas, from foreign countries, has diminished significantly, and I can't see it picking up to the level that it was before. And one of the big markets was tourists coming from China. I mean, of course, China has its own restrictions on people leaving the
Yes.
country at the moment because of COVID. So it's a lot of factors affecting tourism.
I think now we'll go to some contributions from online, please.
That's a nice segue with China. Grateful for your thoughts on Myanmar's relations with China. What role does China play with Myanmar?
Well, China has got a very important relationship with Myanmar. I mean, it's got a land border of around 2,000 kilometers. So it's quite significant. Trade between China, Yunnan province and Myanmar is quite strong. China's interests in Myanmar are primarily stability on the border would be its highest priority. Second priority would be the Belt and Road Initiative, in particular, a connection to the Bay of Bengal through deep sea port at Chapyu, and rail and pipelines connections as well. In terms of the coup, China had a good working relationship with the National League for Democracy government under Aung San Suu Kyi. And I would think that that they would not have been happy with the coup, but their policy essentially is to deal with whoever is necessary to deal with and pursue those interests, which are about stability and their infrastructure priorities. And of course, the sale of weapons, which continues, military equipment.
Following.
I don't see as was initially, there was some speculation, particularly coming from within Myanmar in the early days of the coup, that somehow China was behind it or China was supporting it. I think that idea is a bit far-fetched.
Whilst your talk is focused on companies, do you have an opinion on official bilateral or multilateral aid?
Well, most donors, if not all, have stopped bilateral aid, that is aid that goes through Myanmar agencies, but are continuing with humanitarian aid, particularly on the border regions to refugee camps and to support for the multilateral agencies, the World Food Programme, for example, UNICEF, and the work that they are doing within the country. But the aid that was previously more the development finance, which was going to working through and with government ministries, has come to an end.
And just following into, should Australia or even ASEAN be negotiating with foreign companies in Myanmar to instigate change? Is that possible?
Sorry,
Should Australia or even ASEAN be negotiating with foreign companies to instigate change?
What I was suggesting in my talk was the change that the foreign companies can bring about is more in terms of strengthening responsible business behaviour by modelling good treatment of their employees and the standards that are of the workplace and so on, not a direct confrontation with the military government.
So it's a modelling difference as opposed to a direct influence?
Yes, but I think organisations such as the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, Myanmar's Institute of Company Directors, the programs that they were running, which improve governance standards and the professionalism of the private sector, senior, not the large type of private sector, are important for Myanmar, particularly as cronyism is expanding and corruption is expanding. I think trying to instill a stronger responsible business culture in the country is very important.
Thanks very much, Nicholas, for taking those questions from our online audience, and thanks very much to those of you joining us this afternoon over Zoom. I think we might have time for just a couple more questions here in the room. We'll take one from the back, please. Yes.
How might foreign or Australian companies be encouraged to invest or like reinvest in Myanmar after all this? Because I feel like you've been saying that foreign investment would be like really good at this time.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, am I too quiet? I'll be louder. How do you think foreign companies or Australian companies might be encouraged to invest in Myanmar at this time? Because you've been saying that that would help in terms of like humanitarian responses, but they've got to overcome that stigma again now.
Yeah, I haven't been arguing that we should be encouraging foreign investment, more that the focus should be on those who are currently in Myanmar, both local companies and foreign companies, to ensure that they can become a force for good in terms of how they treat their workforce, their environmental standards, their labour standards, and so on. Which is, it's a little less than encouraging foreign investment. I don't think that would be that was the message I was seeking to give in my talk.
Thank you. And we'll take one last question, please. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up, Nicholas, on the question of modelling, and if you're arguing that companies in Myanmar ought to be encouraged to model good behaviour, and if I then take that to be consistent with a long-term political interest in change over time in Myanmar, were you to be advising the Australian government with a view to that long-term political interest, in what way, if at all, should Australian policy seek to be an amplifier or a complementary force to those companies in projecting or modelling long-term change?
Well, I think through our development assistance program, for example, in addition to providing humanitarian support in border areas, it can work through other NGOs, including civil society groups in Myanmar. I've been focusing on the commercial sector, the private sector, but also in the area of governance and those that are standing up for human rights in Myanmar. That sort of assistance can still go ahead. It doesn't happen through NAPIDOR and through the government. It's a direct relationship which Australian aid program will have with those organisations.
And then I think we've got one very final quick intervention. Do you want to jump in too? Okay, let's just have two quick final interventions then, Nicholas, if that's all right, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. It's been really interesting. Just building a little bit on what you just mentioned about civil society and groups who are standing up for human rights in Myanmar. Are there many foreign companies who are engaged with civil society or maybe non-state entities who may have de facto control over regions within Myanmar?
So you ask if do foreign companies have relationships with civil society?
Yeah, with non-state entities in Myanmar.
Yes, they, as I mentioned, they look to a lot of these organisations who set standards of governance and of behaviour. For example, the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business is largely funded from the private sector. And so there's a close relationship. Companies are looking for guidance on how to behave, particularly the ones that are staying. The ones that are leaving, leave. But the ones that are staying, they're concerned about their reputation, but they also have a concern for what they're doing, a genuine concern. They want to be doing the right thing. So they look to what the independent NGOs are saying. They look to UN guidelines, they look to the OECD guidelines, the ILO, International Labour Organization guidelines, and ensure that they are complying with those as that's the minimum standard which they seek to. Not all companies are doing this, but my point is the more that do, the better.
Thank you.
And it's more likely from a foreign company than from a foreign Western company than some of the other less principled players who are moving in some of the sales or potentially. Maybe we haven't seen signs, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. And then lucky last, James,
Yes,
please.
very simple question. How do you think the crisis will be resolved?
The crisis, Myanmar's crisis will be resolved within Myanmar by the people of Myanmar. I don't believe it will be resolved by UN resolutions or the actions of ASEAN, the actions of governments imposing sanctions. It'll be some event within Myanmar. It'll either be a palace coup, if you like, someone within the military who decides that it's not, either they want to become the commander-in-chief and for their own vain reasons, overthrows the commander. I'm not saying this is going to happen soon, but if there is to be change, it'll come from within the military at some point.
So it's possible that Aung San Suu Kyi can make a comeback.
Well, she's well into her 70s. We'll have to see how soon it is before there is change in Myanmar. Well, that's a possibility. I think there has to be concerns for her and for her health in prison at her age.
Please join me in thanking Nicholas Coppel for this. Thanks very much for such a wide-ranging discussion and also for taking us in, I think what we'll all agree are provocative directions. You're challenging our thinking about the best next steps for particularly the engagement of foreign organisations, and in this case, in particular international businesses in Myanmar. And so thank you very much for such an enlivening and stimulating discussion. And thank you also for your efforts to take such a wide range of our questions. I'd just like to end also by thanking the AIIA for their ongoing involvement in this series of events. As I said right up front, we cherish this partnership and we're looking forward to it continuing in the years ahead. In particular, thanks very much to Kim Boyer and her committee for all of the wonderful work that they do, and also on the university side to James Chin, Greg Marshall, and to other colleagues for all of their efforts to bring together such a smooth event.